Hello, my beautiful primates, and welcome. My name is River, and this is the Woodshed, where we take religious fundamentalism out for some instruction. This week's whoopin' goes out to Braxton Hunter. We let him off easy last week, but this video deserves some punishment.
Abortion is not a political issue. It's just an issue that's been politicized.
No, sweetie. Abortion is absolutely a political issue because it concerns the rights of human beings who happen to have uteruses. Well, as a former fundy myself, I can tell you why he says it's not a political issue. It's because truly, all the way down deep in his little fundy heart, he believes that his opinions are the only correct opinions, according to Great Sky Monkey. And what Great Sky Monkey wants transcends politics. It's not politics. This is just what God wants us to do. Okay, Boomer, how come your God can't talk without your lips moving?
But first, we have to understand one fact of which pro-choicers seem to be painfully unaware. Among the pro-choicers who are educated on the issue, it is uncontroversial to say that from the moment of conception, we have new human life.
I'm going to do something that the typical pro-lifer might find a bit surprising. I will stipulate right now that a human's life begins at conception. And I am unanimous in that. But the politics of abortion has nothing to do with the question of when life begins. The Supreme Court's job is to decide matters of law, not of biology. The question of when life begins is a red herring, an irrelevant argument intended to distract us from the real issue. And that is the question of whether women should have the same bodily autonomy as men like Braxton demand for themselves. That said, it bears repeating that not every conception will result in a successful birth. Depending on where you get your data, about 10 to 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, but many more don't get counted because most miscarriages occur before you even know you're pregnant. And that's why some religious traditions, like Judaism for example, consider life to begin when baby is breathing on its own. There are 100 things that can go wrong with a pregnancy, and so it's easy to see why ancient people would adopt an attitude of not counting your chickens till they hatch. However, this is still a religious belief and not a verifiable scientific fact, and as such has no more relevance to the law than Braxton's beliefs. How should we decide which religion gets to be in charge when they all disagree? And that's why we're supposed to have separation of church and state.
The question you really want to be asking is whether this new human life has personhood or represents a new person from the moment of conception.
Isn't this the same question but with different words? What is personhood? Anyway, can you define it? What about someone who is pregnant against their will? Do they have personhood? Now, if we declare that personhood begins at conception, then we must also conclude that millions of persons are conceived and then miscarried every single year without anyone realizing they missed a period.
With this in mind, we're ready to consider an argument against abortion that does not come from a religious perspective.
Whenever the preacher says his argument is coming from a non-religious perspective, you should be skeptical. Fundies believe in living their faith. They call it their daily walk with God. For them, there's no such thing as a not-religious perspective. Your faith is supposed to color and impact everything you do in your life, including how you vote. So why do they need non-religious arguments against abortion? Well, they don't need to convince the faithful believers in the church. They can just say abortion makes Jesus cry and you'll go to hell if you don't vote Republican. This has been the story of American conservative politics since the 1970s. And this strategy works well enough in churches where you're taught to never ever question the eternal, infallible Word of God. Or at least the pastor's interpretation of it. But if they tell me that abortion makes Jesus cry, I'm going to ask them to prove it. And I'm going to need more than some old scrolls as evidence. How will they convince secular people like me to take personhood, whatever that is, away from adult women and give it to embryos? How will they convince us? Well, the short answer is they lie. They twist the meanings of words, they conceal their motivations, they use fallacious arguments, and they manipulate your emotions.
Stephen Schwartz put together what I think is probably one of the best cases against abortion that can be made.
Well, I looked up this author who actually does have some credentials. Stephen D. Schwartz is a former professor of philosophy at the University of Rhode Island. He's written 2 books on the topic, one called Moral Question of Abortion, and another titled Understanding Abortion from Mixed Feelings to Rational Thought. These books claim to examine all sides of the discussion in a fair and balanced manner, but several of the reviewers disagree. Anyway, remember Braxton's claim that these arguments come from a non-religious perspective?
Argument against abortion that does not come from a religious perspective.
So I found another book, or series of books, I guess, by this same author, Why I Am Still a Catholic. Now, come on, can we really have a non-religious argument from someone who writes a book like this? Now, obviously, he believes in Catholicism, and if you adhere to their dogma, you are required to believe that abortion is wrong. Always. Let us briefly consult the Wikipedia. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that since the 1st century, the Church has affirmed that every procured abortion is a moral evil, and the Catechism states that this position has not changed and remains unchangeable. Fair and objective view, my left ass. To say that he's not coming from a religious perspective, that's just plain false. In any other area of life besides religion, we would call this a conflict of interest. And in plain English, we call this a lie, because it's the opposite of the truth. Okay, now we get to the 4 arguments. How many logical fallacies can you spot?
He uses the word SLED, which is an acronym. Each letter stands for something else, a different part of the case against abortion. The S in the word SLED is for size. If we are to determine that the unborn are not persons because of their size, i.e., they're just a small collection of cells, then the argument of the pro-choicer proves far too much. The argument would amount to saying the smaller a human life is, the less a person it is. Thus, short people are less persons than tall people?
So it is true that facts about the physical size of embryos come up in these conversations, but it's for illustrative purposes. For example, most abortions occur early in the 1st trimester when the potential future human is smaller than my thumb. By the way, I'm going to abbreviate potential future human as PFH for the rest of this video because I'm tired of saying it. No one intends for this fact to function as an ethical justification for abortion. This is not the reason why it should be legal. What I think this really is a response to the way that pro-lifers try to exaggerate all abortions like they're late term. If you grew up Fundy, you've heard them screaming about ripping babies from the womb and tearing them limb from limb. Even the phrase partial birth abortion was made up by anti-abortion advocates. It's not a medical term. They're trying to gross you out and play on your emotions, but the picture they paint does not reflect reality at all. According to the CDC, 93% of all abortions are done in the first 13 weeks, and 51% of the total are what they call early medical abortions, which are done with drugs before 9 or 10 weeks. This leaves a tiny fraction of abortions performed in the 2nd trimester or beyond, and these are the cases where the baby was wanted, but something went wrong during the pregnancy. You'll find links to my data sources below, and don't let these people lie to you. So, how many logical fallacies did you spot? Well, I found 3. First, we have the classic straw man, where you misrepresent an opponent's argument so you can knock it down easier. He pretends pro-choice people are using the size of the PFH as the ethical justification, and then proceeds to skewer that instead of addressing the core issue. Second, we have some slippery slope fallacy. He says that if we allow abortion because a PFH is small, then what's to stop us from killing, well, anyone smaller than Braxton, I guess? And third, we have appeal to emotion, because obviously, what kind of a monster would think that way? And by the way, shout out to yourlogicalfallacyis.com. It's a handy resource where you can learn all the fallacies and amaze your friends, or lose them. I guess that depends on what kind of friends you have.
My wife would certainly object to the notion that because she is head and shoulders less tall than I am, that makes her less of a person.
Oh, no doubt. But if there's anything we know about fundy culture out there in Fundiana, it's that what makes your wife less of a person than you isn't her height, it's her distinct lack of a penis. And that's in the Bible. I mean, not exactly in those words, but pretty close. Well, you tell me, would any of these men endure a pregnancy with their own bodies, dangerous or not, without their enthusiastic consent? You can say no, or you can lie. And this I would present to you as Exhibit A, that fundy culture values human life less if it's female. It seems to me that if you value another human's life the same as your own, then you would want them to have the same rights as you in the same situations, right? Love your neighbor as yourself and all that? Or is this more like all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others? Well, that's what they call complementarianism in fundy culture. There's always two elements to it. First, there's the disclaimer. Well, everyone has a different role in life to play. They're all important and equally valid in God's eyes, which is the sugar coating on the turd that is the second part, which is this hierarchy where God is the boss of the man and the man is the boss of the woman, and the kids obey or get taken out to the woodshed. Well, that's just how it is, say the fundies. And sorry, ma'am, no, you may not take it up with God directly if there's a problem with the middle management. Unfortunately, he's still out of the office.
L is for level of development. A common pro-choice claim is that because the unborn are not only small, but also less developed, only a collection of cells, that on that basis they're not actually persons. They're not yet totally developed human life, but merely potentially totally developed human life.
So L is for development. That's awesome. No wonder I couldn't remember what this stupid acronym stood for. I guess I'd first want to ask what is meant by totally developed human life. I mean, I'm not convinced that I'm totally developed yet, and I still have some growing up to do, so could I be aborted? It seems to me that going by this first definition here, we're all in the process of developing until we die.
My 6-year-old daughter is also not a fully developed adult human yet. Is she less of a person? She's a potential adult human. Her level of development is at a reasonably early stage. In fact, she's less developed than my 9-year-old daughter, who is in turn less developed than me. I guess I'm the only real person involved in this equation. But obviously this is false. We cannot bigotedly discriminate based on the level of development.
Yep, all the same fallacies here. Slippery slope, appeals to emotion, straw man. So just like size, the developmental stage is not the ethical justification for abortion. It is simply a fact that is relevant to the discussion. And again, it is because these liars continuously push the false perception that abortions are all late term, which means there's not really much difference between this argument and the previous one. So, moving on to number 3.
E is for environment. The most used response in favor of abortion is that the unborn are not actually persons because of their environment. They're in the womb rather than outside of the womb. Because of this unusual location, they are said to be potential persons, but not yet actual persons.
Unusual location? I mean, I could look it up in the books of science to be sure, but isn't a uterus like the usual location of a PFH?
The problem is that in no other aspect of life do we determine whether someone is a person based on location. Are Africans less persons than North Americans from a North American perspective because they're in a different location? Does one's status of personhood change based on which room of the house they are currently inhabiting?
Wow, dude. Does he think we think it's okay to abort a PFH because it's in a uterus? As opposed to what? A basement? Nothing about this argument makes any sense. And here we have all the same bad logic as before, plus equivocation, also known as the ambiguity fallacy. He's conflating basements in North America with uteruses as if they are the same kind of thing because they are all locations in physical space. But these are wildly different categories of things.
D is for degree of dependency. Since the unborn are dependent on the mother for survival via nutrients, amniotic fluid, etc., the pro-choicers often imply that they are not persons and it is okay to terminate them at the will of the mother, who is, after all, supplying the means by which the unborn survive.
So D is for degree or dependency? Wow, this is a terrible acronym.
But what about the disabled? Elderly people living in assisted living facilities, or anyone else who is dependent on another for their survival. Do they also cease to be persons upon developing such needs?
Uh-oh, watch out for that slippery slope again. Well, I guess if we're gonna abort babies, we might as well terminate grandma too. And he's also equivocating on the word dependent, as a fetus is not dependent in the same way that an elderly person might be. But again, pointing out the dependence of a fetus on a mother is not meant to directly support an ethical case for abortion. The relevant fact here is that the PFH is in another human who is a person with their own rights. And with that, we conclude his 4 bullshit arguments, which are basically all the same argument, but with different vocabulary. And not one doggone word about the pregnant human, or their autonomy, or their personhood, or their rights. This is Christian fundamentalism, y'all. It's fucking ridiculous.
Thus, pro-lifers are justified in saying that abortion is an ignorant, narrow-minded, backwoods, bigoted, animalistic practice.
Oh, you showed me. I guess I'll just go home now.
At least that's what we would all consider it to be if we applied these same principles to any other human life, any other person. I thought the societal norm was to treat humans like humans.
Right. Since when do fundies care about societal norms? I showed you one a couple weeks ago who tells Christians to just ignore societal norms whenever they conflict with their religious beliefs. Well, the social norm today says you should treat queer folks like anyone else. And these Bible thumpers are like, nah, fuck your social norms. And then they whine about being persecuted when society calls them out on that crap. Why are they persecuting me?
I thought the mantra of the day was, I believe in science. Science is not your friend if you're a pro-choicer. Neither is philosophy. Neither is truth.
You used some valid scientific facts, but they were wrapped in 7 not delicious layers of fallacies, assumptions, category errors, absurd comparisons, bad reasoning, bad faith, and misogyny. Yep, that's 7. And now we're at the end of Braxton's video, without one mention of the rights of uterus owners to control their own reproduction. The real issue, the core of it, is that you have 2 sets of rights coming into conflict. On the one hand, you have a human of reproductive age, and on the other hand, you have a PFH. You cannot protect the rights of both at the same time. To use an analogy our Christian friends will know, it's King Solomon threatening to cut the baby in half. Well, we can't cut this baby in half, so to speak. We can't give rights to one without taking them away from the other. Considering that any number of things might prevent a PFH from reaching birth, let alone reproductive age, it seems obvious to me whose rights should come first. But that's it. That's the issue. It's all about how we adjudicate this particular conflict of rights. It's not about when life begins. It's not about the size or the development or the dependency or any of that. Those are all distractions. They're red herrings. They're meant to keep Christians from seeing the patriarchy behind the curtain and meant to manipulate the rest of us into believing their lies. Don't fall for it. Well, alright, that's the whooping for this week. We'll see you next time. Peace. Oh yeah, tell your friends about the show.